The first thing I do is prepare the clay. I'll get a bag of clay and cut it up into little slices, and I weigh each slice. So I know what each pot should weigh, and that gives me some control of how big the pots will be. Once I've weighed the clay out, then I wedge it, which is a kneading motion. I work the clay in a spiral motion and squeeze the air out of it and make it nice and uniform. And then I start throwing. I've centered this clay a little bit, but see how my hands are bumping around a little bit? So you can see it's not quite centered yet. To start throwing, you want this clay to be so centered that if I put my hands on the clay, it looks like they're not moving. So I'm going to go ahead and just center the top portion, which I'm using. When you're throwing off the hump, which I'm doing now, you don't need to center the whole lump of clay. You just center the part that you're using. So now my hand isn't bumping around at all, or barely. So I know it's centered. Another way you can tell is just by looking at it or holding something really steady to it and see if the clay moves back and forth. So that's pretty good. That's actually much harder than it looks to get the clay centered. I mean, for me it's not hard, but for the beginner it's a challenge. Then the next step is to open up that lump of clay. So I go straight down in the middle, and because I'm throwing off the hump, I'm going to kind of mark where the bottom of the pot is. And now I'm going to bring up that clay. I'm going to raise the wall, so I'm pinching the clay a little bit and pulling up on it. The wall is getting thinner. I have to make sure to keep it evenly lubricated with the water so that my hands slide, fingers slide on the clay. Okay. And always want to stay a little bit on the rim just to reinforce that, keep it nice and strong and round. Putting moisture, water back on there. And just moving some of that water evenly up and down the sides can be a good thing too. I could take some of this slurry off the side and put that back on. Now I've got it about as thin as I want the walls, and now I'm going to push out and start shaping. And I want a little change of direction there. Fingernails are good tools. And just mark that. Yeah, very simple tools for usually for pottery making. I have this stick that has a rounded end and a pointed end, which I'll use in a little bit. Usually I use that down at the bottom to kind of finish off if I'm throwing directly on the wheel, and later I'll show you what I'm going to do with that. Just a simple sponge and ribs. For this little pot, I just use a little rib. So I'm just going to refine that curve a little bit with a rib and go into that little corner there. And then I can turn it around and refine that curve. And just put a little throwing ring in the bottom. Now I'm going to mark where I want to cut this off. So that's a really important step because you want the string to cut the pot off at as level as possible. If I cut it off at an angle, it'll make it difficult for me later on. So in this case, a piece of string is best. Usually I use wire with two little wooden toggles on it to cut the clay off, but the string is a little more forgiving than the wire, and it goes very nicely into that groove I made. And I pull on it and then dry my hands so that the clay doesn't slide out of them, and just pick up that pot. When I'm making mugs and other things that have attachments like handles, you need to let the pieces get leather hard first, and then you trim the bottom. Maybe you want to put a foot on it, maybe you don't. My mugs actually don't have a foot on them, and then you put the handle on when they're a little stiffer. You attach it by do what's called slip and score. You just rough up the surface a little bit where you're going to attach the handle, and use a little bit of slip, which is just clay that's been wet down, like this stuff, something like that, and just press it into the pot. Yeah, and I like to see my finger marks, so I actually use my fingers to push the handle into the pot, and you'll see my finger marks on all my handles. Then I put them on my pipe racks to dry, and mugs, maybe in a couple days will be dry and ready to bisque. So then they'd go into the electric kiln for bisque fire. I fire the bisque to about 1700 degrees Fahrenheit. You want to go slowly because first you want to make sure that there's no air in the piece so that it doesn't explode, and then you also want to drive off any gases that are in the clay that will otherwise make little pinholes, bubbles in the glaze. So that's an important part. And then once they're bisqued, then I apply the glaze, which I have buckets, 5-gallon buckets. Some of my main glazes, I'll have like a 40-gallon bucket full of glaze. And I pour the glaze on the inside and then usually dip the glaze for the outside. And then the piece goes into the gas kiln. I have 4 spy holes where I can peek into the kiln, and in each spy hole I have cones, which are these little clay things that stick up that melt at a specific temperature. They're much more accurate than just going by temperature. And when cone 11 is down, I know the kiln is done. So potters, they always ask each other, what temperature do you fire to? Well, I fire pretty hot. I fire to cone 11. And that's about 2,200 degrees, but that's not, the temperature is not that accurate because it actually reacts to time and temperature. So just like you could bake a cake at 250 and have it be done in maybe 2 hours, as opposed to 350 and have it be done in 1 hour. So the temperature is not that critical. It's time and temperature that makes the difference. Glazes are affected by several things. The application is important. The clay that they go on makes a huge difference. You get different colors in the glazes depending on what's in the clay, if it has iron in it or not. Most glazes are shades of gray, and then some will be, the iron-bearing glazes will often be brown or reddish brown. My best-selling glaze I call Seafoam. It's a shiny light blue glaze, and people love it. It's got nice variations in it. Actually, all the glazes I use have variations in them. I like glazes that aren't flat. That usually they'll change with the application, with the thickness of the glaze. My next, probably most popular color is plum purple, which has some blues and reds in it. And it usually is a very unpredictable glaze. The other glazes that I use, there's tomoku, which I always use with little stamps of kind of abstract little fish and spirals that turn kind of a golden color on top of a very dark blackish brown, changing to more reddish brown depending on the thickness of the glaze. And then there's the ohatakaki, which is kind of a slightly tomato red. It's an iron red that I have used with a black accents on rims or handles, which I think goes very nicely with the tomoku. They kind of complement each other because they have similar colors to each other. Oh, and I also use a crackle celadon, yeah, which that I use on a white stoneware because it's a very transparent glaze, and on my regular stoneware would be very gray. So on the white stoneware it just turns a soft green, which I like, and it gets a little crackle. The crackle is actually a fun thing because it's still happening after the firing, you know, for 1,000 years it will still add crackles to it. Really? If you go to the Museum of Fine Arts and look at some of the ancient celadons, they're still changing over time because they keep getting more and more little crackles. Oh, wow. Yeah, so the celadon actually gets more beautiful over time, I think. I started out in my art career being interested in sculpture, and I'm kind of coming full circle, I think. My new work now is tending to be much more sculptural. I'm making a lot of vase forms that I'm thinking of them in a more sculptural way. I'm definitely thinking of them as vases because I love flowers and I love, you know, putting them in arrangements. And I'm really enjoying working with clay in a more organic way, where I work the clay in ways that I think more connected to the growing process of plants, where I roll the clay a lot and let it a natural edge form, and I use that in a lot of the pieces that I'm working on now because I want them to have that organic element to them. A lot of the pieces also have the harsher edge as well. It's on the sides, or the bottoms will be more refined, but some of the edges have that natural quality. And from that, I've almost by accident started making leaf forms, and I'm really enjoying those too. And the leaf forms are really totally very organic, of course. And they have, the way I roll the clay, it ends up looking very much like a leaf. If you look closely at a leaf, the edge is never, you know, a hard edge. It always has little undulations in it. And that's kind of the way the clay turns out when I hand roll it in that way into a shape. And I'm really enjoying working with that. And I'm also applying, when I apply glazes, some of these pieces I'm using a very dark clay, and the clay is so beautiful that I'm not applying glaze. But when I do apply the glaze, I'm trying to be very loose with it. Not all my work is done on the potter's wheel. I also do a lot of slab-built work, and a lot of the slab-built pieces are draped over molds that I've made and designed. You start out with a sheet of clay. The clay is rolled with I have a big roller machine that rolls it, and then you drape it over a mold, and then it stiffens up over the mold, and then you take it off and add handles and whatnot. My regular line is a gray stoneware. Right now I'm making some teacups to go for some to go with some teapots I just made the other day. So it's sort of like a little treat for me working in porcelain, because I don't usually do it. The different clays bring out different things for me, and I've been working in stoneware for so long that sometimes it's hard to be creative and have fun with the other clays. And for me, this is like having fun with a clay. The clay is kind of magical, the way it moves. It's so responsive. Of course, you have to work with gravity. If you get anything very horizontal, it'll want to collapse on you. Each piece has its own choreography of movements that will create that piece. And when I'm making like my regular mug, my hands know what they're doing. I don't even have to think very much. But with these, I'm still exploring.